So, welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another battle replay and to probably the map we have seen most commonly this year that we hadn't seen all that often before. This is the Hidden Orc Valley, and the reason I'm doing this one is because it's the only one actually in my backlog from Winged Swordsman 44 that I believe I haven't done yet, and it was because this is a map that we have seen a couple of times already this year. But it is a good map. It's similar in many ways to some of the Mountain Pass maps, only there is a little bit more of a clear distinction between attack and defense on it. I don't necessarily know how that's going to pan out this time, given the fact that under normal circumstances the defending faction start off over on this side of the mountains, whereas on this occasion it's going to be the other way round. I can only assume there's going to be some manner of grace period involved, just because there is quite a lot of disparity between where all of the defenders and the attackers are, but maybe that could make things a little bit more interesting, you never know. We're probably not going to be seeing the settlement used, which is probably for the best, because the frame rate does, even on this PC, tend to take a little bit of a stuttering approach to it, which is a little bit of a shame, but this is also not a particularly good area for the defenders to try and defend, because they're always going to be defending downhill of any forces that are going to be coming after them, so it doesn't really make a lot of sense to actually utilise that, but that is where the orcs have hidden themselves in this particular mountain system. So we'll go through the attacking armies first and foremost. The red team, I believe it is going to be good versus evil as well, so that's nice. And we shall start off with Darthy Darth, who's going to be playing as the Dwarves of Khazad. We've seen a fair amount actually of the Dwarves of Khazad lately, and for fairly good reason. It's because they're obviously a very, very solid faction infantry-wise, and in mountainous maps where there's obviously going to be a little bit more close quarters fighting, and the heavy armour really will start to pay dividends, because as you get involved in those grindy fights, keeping your units alive is going to become a little bit more difficult without the kind of armour values that the Dwarves pack on. Khazad Reclaimers also are going to be good in an offensive capacity here, because it means they're going to be able to really rain down an awful lot of punishment and into any choke points that the defenders may be occupying. In particular, very good phalanx busters are axe throwers, because armour and shields do manage to mitigate the damage of axe throwers somewhat, unlike javelins and crossbow bolts, but they have such high base damage that if you are without those two things, units do have a tendency to melt. Khazad Reclaimers also double as pretty effective axe infantry in melee as well. We've got some warriors of Khazad. Being on the attack as a faction like Khazad, where you've got a lot of expensive units, you're going to have to lean a little bit more heavily on your regular units, but that's not really the curse that you may think it to be, because the regular dwarven units are very, very good in class, and they're still going to be able to more than go toe to toe with many of the orcish units, which we will probably be seeing on the defence, and I know that Rudar are one of the defending factions as well. He has still punted to go for some Legion units though. Upgraded 3rd Legion represent the best massable unit of line infantry that Khazad can field, and naturally they're going to be pretty good at keeping themselves alive with those armour values, but also their attacking capabilities are also pretty good, given the fact that their weapon is a one-handed axe, and those do tend to be a little bit more aggressive as far as infantry units go. So they're going to be perfectly capable of doing a lot of damage to the kind of units they're going to be facing off against today. Sons of the Fallen are a very expensive unit of upper end spears, but naturally they're going to be very, very good defensively. So if Khazad do manage to set themselves up in a single position where they want to stand and fight, the Sons of the Fallen represent probably the best unit they can put on the front line outside of any of their bodyguard units, purely because of their ability to keep themselves alive. And then there is also the other stuff that spears have, like slightly better mass when you put them into formation, and the anti-cavalry bonus, which may be important in this battle. We'll have to wait and see what the various compositions elsewhere look like. He has gone for 3 bodyguard units, which is fairly greedy, considering how expensive they are and how small the units are. Depends on what his allies have brought, whether or not they can make up for the lack of numbers that this will obviously cause. Legion Bodyguard are basically the normal bodyguard unit the dwarves have, multiple HP, obviously very good stats, and the Guards of Khazad and Meteor Guard go a step further in 2 different aspects. The Guards with armour piercing attacks, and the Meteor Guard with a 3rd hit point. We've seen how effective both of these units can be in the past. Meteor Guard in particular, that 3rd hit point on a shielded unit of infantry makes a big difference to their survivability. And then a couple more units of warriors over here. So not a huge ranged presence, only axe throwers, but considering they only have 1 unit of archers to pick from, that's not terribly surprising. Their nearest army are their fellow dwarves. They have Erebor 2 times here. He's got a couple of units of bodyguard tier infantry as well, going for 2 rather than 3 though, which may be a little bit wiser. We have the armor-piercing dragon slayers, very much the equivalent of the guards of Khazad we've already seen. The obsidian guard, however, represents a kind of unit which Khazad do not have access to, a bodyguard unit which trades in their shield for a second one-handed weapon. In melee, they are extremely difficult to kill because of the melee defense having that second weapon gives them. They do lack a little bit more at range though, given the fact they do lack that shield, but given the armour and the multiple HP nature of them, it's still a tough task to kill them with basic arrow fire at the very least. The main thing which sets Erebor apart from their dwarven cousins are of course crossbowmen, the Ironfoot crossbows. Stopping power on them is very, very impressive, as you would imagine. It's the sort of thing which is going to give the defenders a significant amount of trouble, you would imagine, if they set up in the wrong position, because if you are exposed, crossbows can do an awful lot of damage to your front line very quickly. Even more worrying are the body-piercing projectiles coming from the Blacklock Engineers. Now, we've already seen on the attack recently, on that map, on that battle on Longbottom, how effective the Dragon's Wrath crossbows were. Same thing certainly applies to the Blacklock Engineers. If you allow them to get a foothold and get some good volleys through a dense front line, then it's the sort of damage which you're going to struggle to recover from as defenders. Several units have upgraded Ironfoot Warriors, so they're going to be a little bit tankier than they otherwise would be. Again, the basic line infantry unit for the dwarves in the same way that the warriors of Khazad were for the Khazad dwarves. Still going to be very efficient though, the Ironfoot Warriors, that armour is certainly going to help them out. We have the Ironfoot Halberds, so a bit of a phalanx going on, which Khazad do lack actually in their composition. The fact that Erebor have decided to go for halberdiers and pikes means that they're going to be able to more easily anchor their line in place. Maybe they can also fill that role for Khazad. And there are some Ironfoot spears in there as well, which again defensively they're going to benefit from being spearmen, but they do lack the killing power that the Ironfoot Warriors will have. There's also a unit of Dwarven Miners here, a unit of militia tier shock troops really, which is kind of a rarity in the game, but unlike many of the other dwarves, they will melt away pretty quickly if you send them into an engagement they're not comfortable in, which is quite a few. Now then, the Elves, Mirkwood on the field today under the command of Proxima Centauri. It's got some blades of Emenduir. Obviously the Elves, even more so probably than the Dwarves, are going to be expensive to field a lot of your very best units, so going for some of the more basic Emenduir units is going to be pretty good here. And in much the same way as the Dwarves, they are still going to be efficient against the kind of units they're facing off against today, albeit they do lack a little bit in the armour department, unlike the Dwarves. So the Dwarves are going to be more universally efficient, whereas these lighter Elven units do have more clearly defined weaknesses, even though in melee they're probably even better at slicing their way through lightly armoured orcs. And then more blades of Emenduir. He has still got some of the upper end units, so the Healy Lang, which heavy elven swordsmen are always going to have that position in the army where they have a good amount of killing power, very good melee defense. Again, they're going to want to avoid getting involved with any sort of archers that the enemies may set up, but for the most part, against orcs and many evil men factions, heavy elven swordsmen represent a really, really difficult unit to face in melee. The Elven King's Palace Guard without the armour upgrade here, as they were in the fairly recent knockout tourney where they finished second in the shock infantry stakes, beating out the mighty Pharazim Swordmasters on the way to that position, so every bit worthy of the adoration that they receive, I suppose, and they have an opportunity here to showcase it once again in a real battle situation. The Ents, which good damage spike on them, it depends on what sort of units they get sent into. They fill the same role as trolls do for the orcish factions. Then we have some woodland protectors, javelins. We've already spoken about how effective the Khazad reclaimers may be, not too dissimilar for the woodland protectors here as well. The Greenwood Watchers, daggers in melee, throwing knives at range, which can do a fair amount of damage. They are a little bit vulnerable to missile fire though, which goes for much of the Mirkwood roster to be fair. And then we've got some Woodland Realm Patrols, some Wardens of Amon Lank, and the Elders of the Elven King, representing all of the archers that Mirkwood have at their disposal. The Greenwood Rangers are in there. No, Greenwood Watchers, so no Greenwood Rangers, so no body piercing perhaps, but the Silverthorns from the Elders of the Elven King, and then a lot of the standard archers as well, with the two-handed axe that the Wardens of Amon Lank also bring to the table. Moving on, we have another Dwarven faction actually, the Dwarves of Khazad, played by Leech, so we'll go through this army a little bit quicker. He has decided to go through it for a unit of sentries of Khazad, which we're missing from Darthy Darth's army, so he has got that to help anchor his line in place. Several units of the warriors that we've already seen, several units of the 3rd Legion that we've already seen, although supplementing that with a few units of upgraded 4th Legion as well, so spears, again defensively a little bit stronger in certain aspects, but they do lack the killing power that their line infantry equivalent does have. A couple of units of Hammers of Gundabad. I'm always going to approve of the Hammers because of their locked morale. It really does make a big difference, and it makes them impossible to get rid of unless you kill all of them. And given the fact that they are a very strong unit of shock infantry as well, they're going to do damage to most anything they fight as they fall. So that's a very useful trait to have. Khazad Reclaimers, and then some guards of Khazad and Mithril Guard. So instead of Legion Bodyguard, he's gone for some other units as well, and I think based on the composition that has proven to be a good idea. Last but by no means least, we have got Imladris, played by Mark. Some upgraded swords of Rivendell, which the Rivendell units have a tendency to run contrary to the rest of Imladris in the sense that they, even with an armour upgrade, tend to be quite lightly armoured, whereas much of the rest of the Imladris roster combines the classic elven melee defence with very high armour values as well, making them, in terms of raw defensive numbers, the strongest faction in the game. And that is very true with the Elder Renway Swordmasters, obviously sky-high melee defense values as a result of the class of unit that they are, but also combining that with very fine elven armour. The Gwaithiarth and ever the bulletproof offering of a unit that they are very good defensively, as any bodyguard tier spear unit are going to be, but they have a tendency to outlast tremendous amounts of damage. Elder Renway Spearmen, not multiple HP, but still very, very strong. Going for the armour upgrades and Imladris Guardians as well, so this is looking like an expensive army already from the Owls, but there's no getting around the fact that you're going to be spending some money as Imladris, I suppose. Imladris Sentries are here, we've got some Spears of Rivendell as well, so plenty of polearms. I'm not the biggest fan of the Spears of Rivendell, as I've said many times before, but they should do just fine here, considering the amount of support that's around them. More Swords of Rivendell. We've got some Archers of Rivendell in here as well, I think. No, Norotino Warriors. So they're going to be up to a little bit more in melee. Excuse me. And then finally, some more bodyguard tier units. The God Helene, which represent the Silverthorn Arrow unit that Imladris have with the armour upgrade as well. And also some upgraded Gwaithir Mirdain, which armour-piercing shock infantry, of course. Very, very dangerous. Now then, moving on to the defenders today. Starting off with Winged Swordsman himself, who's playing as the Orcs of the Misty Mountains. He's got some heavy goblin crossbows, which depending on where they set up, these crossbows could be absolutely devastating. I mean, certainly against the heavy armour that Imladris and all the Dwarven factions have at their disposal, crossbows are one of the best ways in which the Misty Mountains can hope to equalise against such a foe. Plenty of trolls as well, cave trolls and snow trolls. If they get committed against the wrong kind of unit, which is very easy to do against the kind of quality that the Dwarves and Elves can commit to the field, they could end up getting burnt down very, very quickly. So timing is always everything with the trolls, but it's going to be a smaller window that the Misty Mountains have to be effective with these kinds of units here. Blackbacks are in there. One of the units which will cause concern for the attackers, even with all of the quality they have. Blackback Berserkers can be especially savage because of the damage they can deal. We have got heavy goblin spears, so a spear-based front line with armour piercing going to be useful here, considering the fact that they're going to need to be quite organised here, the Misty Mountains. If the battle does get overly chaotic, they can use their numbers, but in this kind of situation they really need to be keeping quite regimented and choosing the right positions to engage their opponents, given the kind of opponents they're up against. Drake Broodlings we've seen be effective a couple of times recently. If you can keep them moving, they can be a real pain, and especially against lighter factions like Mirkwood, they could prove to be very, very useful. There are Black Uruks in there. There is also the locked morale of the Mountain Orc Berserkers to consider. Potentially very, very useful. There's also heavy goblin infantry in here to help pad out the numbers. And there may be a couple of other units hidden in and amongst there as well that we simply cannot see. But fairly standard fare for the Misty Mountains, although maybe a little bit more troll and monster heavy than they would otherwise be. We have another Misty Mountains army played by Diego Rio Ramos. I don't know what else he has got that his allies have not. He's got some Bolgs champions, so there is a little bit of cavalry action going on here potentially. Of all of the warg units, which tend to be having a focus around anti-cavalry, the Bolgs champions probably do the best when it comes to being a unit of shock cavalry as well, because of the lances that they have. Otherwise, we have got some White Orc Fearmongers, going to be really good for holding the line actually. The Misty Mountain's other whole army unit, the Heavy Goblin Halberds, are very, very basic in nature. The White Orcs, however, do offer some good quality. Mountain Uruk Host, which good unit of line infantry actually, kind of the equivalent to the Uruk-hai infantry, as I keep saying. It's a good benchmark to use because everyone knows the Uruk-hai infantry are a unit of good quality troops, and the Mountain Uruk Host are really very, very similar to them. So they're going to be helping to hold down the front line. More black backs, unsurprisingly. There's Goblin infantry at the back to help pad out the numbers. More Heavy Goblin spears. So yeah, nothing too surprising, and probably going to be some Heavy Goblin crossbows. Indeed there are in and amongst there as well. The Misty Mountains do have a fair few units that can hide, so they may well reveal themselves as the battle goes along. And last, we have another Misty Mountains army under the command of Herr Tumihai. Blackback Berserkers, the first instance where we've actually seen the Goblin King's Bodyguard, a very dependable unit of multiple HP sword and board infantry. Artillery, which we have seen used to utterly devastating effect on this map in the past. Very, very nice. We've got some cave trolls, we've got... yes, some snow trolls are in there. Plenty of spears too. Black Uruks of the mountains, Heavy Goblin Halberds are here in fairly high numbers as well. No White Uruk Fearmongers in this army, but going for more numbers here, which is understandable. I mean, when you're on the defence here as the Misty Mountain, even when you're on the defence as the Misty Mountains, going numbers heavy is still going to net you some results, I feel. So could be a few more units that could reveal themselves. I mean, we are going to make a cut here. I don't think we're going to see the battle get underway super fast, even though Winged Swordsman and 2 times are over here right next to one another. I think the grace period will mean that 2 times does have to allow the Misty Mountains force to pass and doesn't make them double back and go around the other way. I mean, we'll see, but if they do engage, then it will be a very short cut indeed, but I highly doubt that will be the case, given this is a long battle anyway. So I think they're going to allow the Misty Mountains to post up in position, and then we'll see. I mean, this is interesting. The defenders going for... It's rare perhaps we see the defenders be more numbers centric and the attackers be more quality centric, and it's more or less enforced given the Dwarven and Elven attackers and then the Goblin defenders. But we'll see. Will the Goblins be forced out of the mountains once and for all, or will they manage to hold back the Elven and Dwarven tide? I'll rejoin when the battle's getting underway. So actually, not as big of a cut as it could have been, all things considered, considering the armies had to move around pretty much the entirety of the map. And this is a long one anyway, even with the 10,000 frames that were purely in the manoeuvring phase. But we are now underway with the crossbows of the Misty Mountains thudding into the initial ranks of the elves, who are going to be attempting to whittle down the very numerous defenders. As mentioned in the composition phase, the fact that the attackers are more quality-centric with the Dwarven and Elven presence that they have, and the numbers of the defenders make this somewhat interesting. It does mean that the defenders, when things get a little bit more grindy in the choke points, they won't be able to depend on their quality quite so much. I think their supporting units are going to be all-important here. However, stuff like the crossbows should be really, really effective against the slightly smaller attacking armies that they're going to be dealing with, because it means they're going to be able to get value off pretty much no matter what they decide to go after. Although it is worth mentioning that if they are used for skirmishing purposes, like they are currently being used for over here on the northern end of the pass entrances, then I don't know, that may not be the right way of going about things, but they may not have much of a choice either, because they can cut down the initial Elven skirmishers pretty effectively by doing this. And it does mean that the initial softening of their front lines won't be quite so extreme. The first ranks of heavy goblins on the front line, although regardless of whether it's elves or dwarves, and it is going to be elves here as the Blades of Amenduia charge into battle, both of these units are going to be very effective against heavy goblins, though at the very least the heavy goblin spears will find themselves more at home facing the dwarves with that bit of armour piercing they bring to the table. It's going to be rough going for them against the less armour focused Elven infantry, and the Blades of Amenduia should be very, very good in this kind of situation, albeit numbers are against them. They are going to need more than just one unit. The heavy goblins are here in swarm-like quantities, and it seems like Mirkwood concur, because they are going to be sending forward another unit and that should be more than sufficient to turn this battle around in the long run, albeit Blackback Berserkers being committed fairly early, but as defenders you do have a lot of money to play with, and going into the red limit for the Misty Mountains is pretty easy, especially when you can fill out the rest of your army with lower quality units like the heavy goblins that we can see here. It means that you are going to be more able to bring more units by going into the red limit than many other factions will be able to. So early commitments of stuff like Blackbacks is not the most surprising thing in the world. You can see here that the Woodland Protectors, again, this fairly savage response to the initial skirmishing that the attackers are trying to do here, and Mirkwood have certainly been given a bloodied nose in that regard already, but somewhat out of necessity, and it does mean, of course, this is ammunition that they're not going to have to deal with later on, the attackers. Warriors of Khazad are joining in with the Blades of Amenduir. Defeat is a distinct possibility apparently, but the Blackback Berserkers really do skew that fight fairly significantly. It looks like the trolls could be on the way as well, some snow trolls and some cave trolls, so the defenders are not being shy here. They're very willing to commit some pretty heavy hitting expensive units here to even just the initial assault from the attackers, and I suppose this does kind of force the attackers in many ways to consider bringing forward some of their own very strong units. And again, with trolls, spears are not really the best thing for you dealing with trolls, but the 4th Legion were the only thing on hand that could quickly stem the bleeding of all of these monstrous units are causing. But so far so good for the defenders. That's been reasonably well executed, but we'll see if it does prove to be efficient as the battle does trundle on, because of course it's a lot of crossbow bolts they've already utilised, and if their trolls start falling as well, things could start getting a little bit messy. This fight also underway, and also early commitments of the trolls over here, cave trolls, the Imladris forces leading the way with their upgraded Swords of Rivendell. The Khazad Reclaimers are in the background, so throwing axes are going to be very, very effective, especially against heavy goblin halberdiers. A few dwarven units in here as well, but similar story over here where the numbers of the defenders are such that their lines have held pretty well, and the damage spike that the trolls have offered has also put a real dent into the attacking progress so far. And also the halberds offer a good anchor over here. They're not using polearms on the other side of the field just yet, but halberdiers do mean they're going to be able to hold the enemy at arm's length a little bit more so. You can see here some dead units on the floor. Some dead Ironfoot crossbows as well, so Erebor struggling to make an impression early on, as they are the ones that have been given the rather unenviable task of going up this hill. It's very steep, and the defenders have got plenty of positions that they can hit you on the way up. Erebor biding their time for the moment until their allies have gained a bit of ground perhaps, but that's a dangerous game to play, because if their allies don't gain ground for a long period of time, it means they've just been sat there doing nothing. So putting their fate in their allies' hands somewhat over here. Fighting fire with fire though, the attackers now, by committing their Ents in, which should have a similar effect as the trolls. The only problem is the Blackback Mountain Berserkers are going to be very effective against the Ents with the damage they can deal, so almost predetermined that the outcome of this would be a little bit more favoured for the defenders, and that's only going to increase with the Mountain Orc Berserkers offering yet more damage and more armour piercing to the equation. Snow Trolls are very deep behind enemy lines now though, and with the arrival of the Hiri Lan, that is going to be the sort of thing which will cut down the Snow Trolls very, very quickly, and you can see they are starting to drop like flies. So Trolls very much living up to the reputation as a bit of a flash in the pan, but reasonably decent kill count I'm sure they picked up, but breaking even probably at best, which obviously for the defenders, breaking even alone is probably not good enough in many cases, so they're going to need to hope that the rest of their trolls can do the business. They're definitely going to be able to finish off that unit of very battered Woodland Protectors. Some reinforcements were needed for the defenders in all fairness, so it's a timely arrival of their Mountain Orc Berserkers. The heavy goblin infantry is shaken, which is not too surprising given the pressure that their front line is under. Missiles coming in, and good quality elven and dwarven infantry pressurising the front line, so the weakest among the goblins considering fleeing, especially with the Ents starting to crush their skulls. But with the high quality around them, heavy goblin infantry trying to flee. I mean, they're not routing as a result of this, which is quite surprising. I think they were maybe just trying to bring the trolls out, and now they're re-engaging, but yeah, more heavy goblin spears, so willing to continue fighting down here for the moment. Some of the heavy goblin crossbows are still firing, but not all of them, which is pretty vital. They can't afford for all of them to be firing. Half the enemy force remains, so it's already been a very bloody affair with plenty of the battle still to go. as the heavy goblin spears start moving in. As we move over to the other pass, there may be two ways in over here, but it converges into one ultimately. See over here, looks like some Legion bodyguard, so perhaps seeing that some quality is going to be needed to really start putting the screws to the Misty Mountains, the Legion bodyguard coming in, and of course, even with the phalanx here, the heavy goblin halberds are largely alone at this point, with the odd standard goblin infantry in and amongst them. Yeah, and here come the blackbacks. Definitely necessary here to try and prevent the dwarves from gaining a huge amount of momentum from committing a bodyguard unit of this quality, but I think the attackers will probably need a little bit more if they are to continue this advance. The blackbacks, of course, are very dangerous and damaging as far as the bodyguard unit goes, but as with most very aggressive units like this, they do suffer a bit in some of their defensive values. As a dual wielder, they do mitigate that somewhat, but still. Erebor moving up with their crossbows again, going to try and maybe whittle down the defences. They've gone unnoticed for the time being by the looks of things, and indeed Erebor are starting to try and probe the line, but sending one unit of Ironfoot warriors and Ironfoot pikes forward is really not going to be enough. You're going to need a lot more to comprehensively challenge the sheer amount of goblins that are waiting for an advance up here, and most of these goblins happen to be armor piercing as well, so numbers and armor piercing make up for the individual lack of quality that many of these units have, and making life very, very difficult for the initial advance here of Erebor. Not the best of starts, you'd have to say there. So far the defenders will be fairly pleased with how this has gone, but I will say they have also been very forthcoming in terms of how they've been using their resources, which may yet prove to be a problem, although really gaining the momentum over here with the commitment of those spears and then following that up with some black uruks as well. The attackers not having enough on the front line to actually sustain their assault, and the Misty Mountains now forcing the attackers onto the back foot. Some warriors of Khazad have arrived, but they're going to need more than a single basic unit of infantry here, I think, to stop the bleeding. More quality is required. I think the reason why they're probably reluctant to send more units forward to be reinforcements more directly is the presence of all those crossbows. If they send forward elite units, the crossbows are simply going to shoot them, but the price they're paying for not having reinforcements on hand is clear for all to see here, as they find themselves thoroughly on the back foot. And now the Bolg's champions are sniffing around as well, and if they manage to get some charges into more exposed units, this could end up being very, very grisly for the attackers. And like I said, given the compositions of their armies, they don't really have the disposable manpower in the way that attackers usually do in a 5v3 to be able to take these sorts of losses for a long period of time. They can for a bit, but not indefinitely. So they need to be a little bit careful here. The pitfalls of being a more high quality faction. The Ents are coming back, and they are going after some out of ammunition crossbows who are plugging a little bit of a gap in the line, so the Misty Mountains will need a unit of more genuine infantry to pick up the torch here. I mean, they do have units in reserves, and mounting or at coast would be sufficient for that, even if they would still find themselves on the losing side of an engagement with the 3rd Legion. They would at least be able to put up more of a fight than the heavy goblin crossbows, who are already worried, but reinforcements closing in from the side. Blackbacks and black uruks still at the heart of this Misty Mountains effort. Someone recently on one of the videos commented that the Misty Mountains are not a particularly good faction. I don't really agree with that. I think the Misty Mountains are perfectly fine as a faction, the way they go about things. I mean, in terms of overall quality, of course, but their strengths are well documented, and so far their numbers focused approach has served them pretty well, although that could turn around as the battle goes on. If it does turn into more of a 1v1 mano a mano kind of fight, then that's where the attackers will start to thrive, but for the time being this front line has managed to stabilise itself with the addition of black uruks and white uruk fearmongers, so any advances the attackers were hoping to make there have been stopped. Erebor once again just sending forward individual Ironfoots, and you can see that they're struggling because this is a healthier unit of Ironfoots, and they're already shaken as they start to engage with the goblin front lines. So They're going to need to send forward a more substantial force than this, or simply stick to the skirmishing with crossbows. But I think the skirmishing with crossbows was never going to work, because Hertumihai has got his own crossbows in a superior position, will be able to get the first and probably second shots off before the Ironfoots can even respond. And it's a bit of a, again, it is an awkward situation for Erebor, this I will say, because if they do start to make progress, that's when the Misty Mountains will turn their crossbows onto the infantry, I'm sure. But the crossbows don't have the best of shots, I have to say. The angle isn't really with them. Their own units are in the way, so I still think that probably the best use of his time would be to commit to a more general advance, but we'll see. Victory seems certain for the defenders over here as well, the numbers still serving them well. Those white Uruks make for the best anchor to a front line that the Misty Mountains can field, a strong unit of halberdiers. You can see they're starting to leak in behind the front line, so their throwing axes are forthcoming, but with Blackback starting to engage the Khazad reclaimers, it would worry a little bit for their continued existence. As the hatchets continue to fly, more infantry units on the way forward, plenty of reserves as you can see, and plenty of really high quality reserves from Khazad and Imladris as well. So they won't be panicking just yet, but the defenders will still be pleased with how the first engagements have gone. Yeah, Erebor, unsurprisingly, routing as a result of undermanning the front line. And the Drake Broodlings are moving forward again. Looks like the front line has retreated to one of its initial positions, and now you can see bowling through their own units of the Drake Broodlings. I don't know how effective this is necessarily going to be. I mean, they can go through enemy units and start feasting upon the skirmishers, I suppose, or getting behind, but you're not going to be able to rout the hammers of Gundabad, so this isn't something that is going to cause them to run. And the 3rd Legion, I mean, the upper echelon of Khazad are difficult to rout in general, even when you're not talking about their locked morale offering. Hammers of Gundabad, in all fairness, will actually be pretty effective against most things that the Misty Mountains have to offer. So that's worth bearing in mind. The projectiles continue to fly. Heavy gobbo crossbows still doing their thing. The Volks champions again in behind enemy lines. They are difficult positions to take, as we have seen on this map over the course of the last year or so. These positions can be a bit of a nightmare for the attackers to go through. We have seen it ultimately pay off. They've taken a lot of damage, but then the defenders have started to falter. And now the Bolgs champions are going to make just the process of getting reinforcements up the hill more difficult, and managing to charge into some exposed elders of the Elven King as well. Any of those that they can kill off will definitely pay off later on. And considering I don't know how useful the Bolgs champions will be if the defenders do need to retreat into the interior of the mountains, it's worth using them now when you know they're going to be somewhat effective. There's a few Mountain Uruk host in here, but they're broken and fighting to the death, taking a real beating at the hands of the hammers as crossbow bolts continue to fly, trying to whittle down this more high quality attack now. And you can see that the defenders starting to struggle a little bit in pure melee terms with the armour piercing that the hammers offer, and then the defensive nous that the 3rd Legion are providing to the front line as well. So the crossbow bolts will be required to help turn this fight around. Only 17 4th Legion remain there. Some out of ammunition heavy goblin crossbows will probably be enough to finish them off, but you never can tell. Heavy goblins are very poor in melee. But surely the numbers discrepancy here is too great. On clean-up duty, and then they can act as fodder on the front line, which is becoming more and more necessary. That initial momentum that the Misty Mountains were able to claim in this engagement is gone, and it's slowly slipping back in favour of the attackers. And they're routing now, engulfing the Misty Mountains front line, and they're going to try and plug the gap with the heavy goblin infantry. Instead of setting up a new front line, they are content to reinforce the existing one in spite of its failing nature, which is fine as long as they can do that damage from afar that they want to continue to do, clearly. Meanwhile, back end here, the south side, we have Imladris down there now, maybe giving Erebor a bit of a hand, which is fair enough. Erebor, of course, the only faction, seemingly initially, to have to take on a front line on their own, and probably the least attractive one at that. Starting to get forced onto the back foot here a little bit as well, the attackers. Some Spears of Rivendell trying to move forward, polearm to polearm with the Fearmongers, but again, it's a numbers discrepancy here, which is the main problem, and when you consider that it is fearmongers, and I think there's the odd blackback in there as well, albeit they are pretty depleted at this point, but they also have the higher quality here. The attackers only have basic stuff. They don't have any ranged coming in. They may be trying to utilise those 25 Khazad reclaimers. But this kind of engagement, unless you're doing some range damage of some description, you should probably be thinking about reinforcing this front line, because it's only going one way as it stands, and there the Discord beeps. Wonderful. I really should have decided to go invisible or turn Discord off before I started to record, but it's been a while since we've had such things. I do have it so that people can see when I'm playing Medieval 2. I don't understand why you would decide that this is the time. You must know I'm recording. No matter. Hammers of Gundabad. I mean, if the Drake Broodlings were to stop in this situation, then the damage that they get dealt would be pretty gnarly. The Goblin Spear's still waiting. Bowling through. I mean, it is making the attackers' advance over here significantly more difficult. And the Black Uruks, a fresh unit of Black Uruks as well, they make for certainly a better opponent for the Elves. They can look after themselves a little bit more easily. They won't outright win 1-1, but better than most of what the rest of the Misty Mountains can do against them, and with numbers to back them up. We've already seen that be effective once. Can it do so again? The Drake Broodling's being used effectively here. This is exactly what you need to use them for. They're not getting a huge amount of kills by doing this, even though it looks destructive. But what they are doing is knocking them over and really making it so that they can't respond to the infantry, which is putting them under pressure, and that will result in kills ultimately. Another column of infantry moving forward, but still the Bolgs champions making this a really difficult march up the hill. Another army falls to half strength. Could be Leech's Khazad army, that, considering the losses that he is currently taking at the hands of the Drakes and the Wargs. Another out of ammo crossbow unit being sent in to just make up the numbers. I mean, these hammers will do a lot of damage to the units that are arrayed against them, but it's still a tough engagement for them, given the level of units. Let's see, Norritino warriors out of ammunition perhaps? Again, like, the Norritino warriors make for a good melee combatant, but not in this kind of situation where the odds are stacked so horrendously against them. They make for a good foil for some of the stronger Imladris units like this, with their higher melee defense from that dual wielding they do possess, but when they're on their own and with the odds against them like this, they're not really going to be terribly effective even with their heightened melee prowess. It is what it is. Clearly, there were some Erebor units over here as well. What's going on here? Still no re-advancement over here, with some Black Uruks retreating from the other side of the field, so largely bubbling away this engagement, but the attackers can tend to just sort of sit here and wait. I'm not entirely sure why either, because the attackers have taken a bit of a beating over here, and if more reinforcements can be committed over here, then Khazad and Mirkwood will just be outright defeated, so I'm not entirely certain why the attackers have decided to ease up on the southern approaches. You need to have more of a unified approach, as we keep saying. It was the death of the attackers really in the last battle we saw on Minas Tirith, and it could well prove to be so here as well. Again, the Drake Broodlings come in. You can see they're bloodied. The Khazad Reclaimers trying to flee the scene. Knocking over those 3rd Legion will allow the armour piercing from the axes of the Mountain Orc Berserkers to land a few more hits. In come another unit of Snow Trolls as well. Time for another damage spike, is it? They need to be careful about getting into melee with the Hammers of Gundabad. That will not be the kind of engagement that the Snow Trolls relish. defeat seems certain for the hammers. Yeah, they're starting to struggle. I mean, sentries of Khazad are all the way forward. What sort of reinforcements they have? Again, sending forward one unit of pikes is not going to change the fate of your attack here. And I think Leech sees that now, and more to the point, so do the defenders, and the snow trolls will make for a very good choice of unit to try and finish off some of these dwarven pikemen. But yeah, they're going to have to just retreat fully from this front line and reorganise themselves. Given the lower amount of crossbows that the defenders surely have at their... Well, I mean, to be fair, they don't have enough to actually mount another big assault. Unless Mirkwood have got some more hidden units, but even then it's going to be stuff like Rangers and... Yeah, Greenwood Watchers over here. Elven King's Palace Guard is still here, so they've got some high quality units, but nothing that can... Yeah, they've left their high quality units for last, and I mean, it allows them to fight more strongly on an individual basis, but considering the amount of units they'll have to fight through on the front line, it's been a bit of a disaster over here for the attackers, in all fairness. And they're also going to pay the price for this over on the other side of the battlefield as well, I think, now, because all of the Misty Mountains is now going to be pointed in this direction, at least at some point. They have a ever-closing window of opportunity, the attackers, to make it so that that's not the case. But I don't know. I think they may have left it too long already, and they may carry their own destruction along with it. But we'll see, there's still a long way to go in this battle. Khazad Reclaimers on the way forward. I mean, there's a lot of reinforcements over here, but they're just sort of sat here doing nothing at the moment, and that's a problem. Some routing from the Misty Mountains. This is the sort of moment where if you had your reinforcements committed already, you would have the opportunity to claim the momentum and really try and surge forward. Yes, there are crossbow bolts, but they're going to be crossbow bolts regardless of whether you advanced 10 minutes ago or whether you advance in half an hour's time. They're going to be there. The defenders are going to utilise their crossbow bolts in something they perceive to be worthwhile, and that isn't going to be the dregs of units that they've been trying to utilise over here for a little while now. I think, if we have a look over here, defenders are not going to chase the attackers, so the attackers have one last assault in them, but it's not going to be a particularly comprehensive one. It has a lot of high quality units in it, but it's not got a lot of numbers, so if the Misty Mountains keep a decent presence over here, they should be fine. And maybe that's the key to success here, just making sure the Misty Mountains have to have a decent amount of units over here to answer the challenge that could come. And maybe that will give the breathing room to the forces here in the south to effect some kind of advance. This is now the only engagement that's really happening over here, and it's still one that the defenders will be more happy with Mountaineer at coast, and also, again, another healthy unit of Blackback Berserkers. They're going to tear their way through standard warriors of Khazad. What is the thinking here? What is the plan that the attackers have? Because any opportunities they may have in this fight are not going to be infinite. They are going to be ever closing. Point in River Wards on the way forward. I mean, heavy Elven Swordsmen will be good. They'll deal a lot of damage, but the fact that Blackbacks are on the front lines means the damage spike that they offer probably won't be the difference in this engagement. Crossbow bolts going after the warriors of Khazad, well, not the warriors, the Khazad Reclaimers that are trying to be the supporting unit to do a good amount of damage here. The Drake Broodlings on the way forward as well. We saw them used to very good effect on the other side. They have less room to work with over here though. But this is the problem. I mean, Drake Broodlings, the living battering rams that they are, they can either be very effective or a complete waste. They're one of those kinds of units, and in this battle they have been very effective indeed. The key is to keep them moving. The amount of kills they pick up won't necessarily be huge, but the fact that they can just be a distraction, a disruption to most of these units is worth its weight in gold. They don't want to be charging into that pike line though. That will cut them down, because I do believe they count as cavalry, so anti-cavalry bonuses are going to be effective against them. And to be fair, in sustained melee, the Khazad Reclaimers will be effective against them as well, as most heavy axemen tend to be, but keeping them moving is the key here. Killing off the odd one or two. Most of the damage, however, is going to be coming from those heavy goblin crossbowmen. Still the fight continues over here. The Broyne and River Wards seems like a fairly even fight actually at the moment, but I think the quality of the Blackbacks will tilt this in favour of the defenders as time goes on. Still got 20,000 frames left in this battle, so it's still rumbling on, and actually counter-attack down the hill, so the defenders taking the fight to the attackers, and maybe this is with a view to utterly destroying the attackers over here, and then they can fully focus on the armies in the south, and that will be, well, that will be a bit of a disaster, won't it? Especially with the kind of choke points that they have to work with over there. If they post up on those hills, it's going to be very, very difficult for the attackers to try and make their way through there. This map does tend to have the same initial defensive points each time we see it, and that's for good reason. They're very, very effective. Although I do believe that the attackers have played into the defenders' hands a little bit in this battle so far. Sentries depleted, trying to make it so that the Drake Broodlings can go about that business less, although this may be a little bit of a problem. Looks as though this counter-attack has not gone brilliantly with this mass route from the Misty Mountains. Maybe asking a little bit much of their regular heavy goblins to go after Palace Guard, Mithril Guard and Guards of Khazad, some of the very scariest units the whole game has to offer. Crossbow bolts continuing to fly. And that's going to be the real damage dealer, any crossbow bolts they still have. Trying to punch through that Mithril armour. Greenwood Watchers able to fire a few throwing projectiles into the side and going after the Blackbacks, the one unit that will cause a bit of trouble for the kind of units that are on the front line here. More infantry on the way forwards. And some cycle charging from the Bolgs champions here. Just what the Doctor ordered, I think. Still a few crossbows. Reinforcements coming in from all this infantry as well, so the numbers have been restored. Yeah, and it's going to be these cycle charges and the crossbow bolts in addition to the numbers that have now made themselves apparent that are surely going to finish off these forces once and for all. Drake Broodlings playing a dangerous game because they do knock over their own units as well. Many of them will get back up. Be interested to see how many kills the Drake Broodlings have got, because most of their effectiveness here has just been as like I said, a disruption tool really. Ooh, and then a charge in as well. While they're still on the floor, the Bolgs champions come charging in, lances down. Getting back out of there is a bit of a necessity though. Any blows coming in from the dwarves, or especially the Palace Guard actually with their anti-cavalry, going to be a concern. Only a military genius could win this battle now. Yeah, the numbers are just too great, even for some of the mightiest warriors in Middle-earth. The Horde is going to swallow them, I feel. Drake Broodlings coming in for another bite of the cherry. We're just staying over here because this is the finality of this engagement. The rest of the battle as a whole may very well be taking place on the southern approaches after this is done with. Yeah, I mean, still fighting hard, but the charge damage and Blackbacks, Bolgs champions, I mean, you have to say the defenders with some of their more specialty units like the Bolgs champions and the Drake Broodlings and the Trolls, all of these units have been used pretty effectively. Maybe less so the Trolls, they've been used in a more standard manner I suppose, but and then with the infantry lines, the numerous infantry lines, the crossbows have been very effective in their support as well. The Misty Mountains I think are good value for their lead at this point in the battle. And it goes to show the merits of having maybe a more numbers-focused defence where you can manage it, if your faction allows you to. Even if they do go on to lose this battle, the positive points still don't go away, as the remainder of the dwarves continue to get cut down, and unsurprisingly, it's mostly Mithril Guard at this point that remain. Over yonder, Blackbacks doing their thing as well. Haven't escaped this fight unscathed though. There were 50 of them when they arrived, and they've been cut down to half their number. Don't know if the level of damage that they have done will ultimately be enough, though. There goes the Dwarven General. He does fall. Is Thranduil still alive in here somewhere? Possibly. We'll find out pretty soon as all of these units have been dealt with. Unless he fled into the open field, which is entirely possible. And there we are, celebrating and victorious. It has cost Winged Swordsman's army. He's probably the least healthy of the defenders at this point, but he won't mind about that. The rest of his force can now move over here to help reinforce, and the attackers are starting to turn up here a little bit. The Gwaithir Arthand are going to be very difficult to get rid of on the front line here, and Heavy Goblin Halberdiers already worried a little bit. Some more dwarves heading forward as well. Support coming forth from Khazad Reclaimers and the god Helene. Silverthorn Arrow is going to be a concern. Still no assaults making their way up the hill, though. Is that going to be an issue? I don't know. Trying to spread your effectiveness. And the Gwaithir Arthand are now actually leaving the front line, so they're turning down the pressure. Again, I'm not sure why. I mean, as the attackers, unless the defenders want to sally forth and take the fight to you, it's up to you to really engage, and you can't depend upon the defenders wanting to be the ones to attack. They have done against the attackers on the northern hill, as we just saw, but that was when they knew they basically had the attackers bang to rights. With the Arthand loitering. Blacklocks could still be effective, but I don't know. I mean, positioning is going to be everything if the Blacklocks want to be the thing to turn this fight around. You can see the amount of reinforcements that the Misty Mountains have littered across that hillside. Swords of Rivendell, they are finally opening up this front line once again, maybe seeing that the crossbows are not the threat that they once were. Charging into the Goblin front line, but again, they're going to need more than one infantry unit here. They do have some Ironfoots, which is good. 2 infantry units will be enough to at least start proceedings over here. Yeah, and Ironfoot Spears. Maybe a more genuine, full-scale attack is going to be forthcoming. I don't know what the attackers' reaction to their allies in the north being utterly defeated would have been, but it was clearly not in their plans given how standoffish they were over here. I think they were hoping for the attackers in the northern part of the settlement to make more of an impression, but I think that's kind of foolish to expect given how we know this map goes and how much damage they were initially taking. They must have mentioned, like, listen, we're taking an awful lot of damage here, so don't depend on us to break through and make your lives easier. And now they have to deal with the entirety of what the goblins have left, rather than just a portion of it. And if the defenders can consolidate themselves, that is very often a way in which they can be extremely effective. And they still, I mean, this is the first example we've seen, actually, of them being able to utilise their artillery. Again, this is a reasonable thing to try and avoid if you're the attackers, and that may very well be why Erebor wasn't keen on advancing more quickly earlier, but do you have a choice, is the point. Wherever the catapult was, if you didn't want to advance up here earlier on, Erebor maybe should have sent some stuff, kept some stuff in the north to help the advance over there. But the Goblin front line is still thick. The catapult will continue to rain calamity down upon them, I'm sure. The Blackbacks have been a real cornerstone of the defence over here. Many of the goblins just standing in the way for sheer numbers' sake, but the Blackbacks offering themselves up as a genuine damage dealer on the front line, and so it has proven to be. Gwaithir Arthand on the way forward once again, which begs the question of why they were taken off the front line in the first place. They would make for a good antidote for the Drake Broodlings as well. They're starting to run a little bit low on manpower over here as well, as you can see. Imladris still have another really good sized wave in them, but other than that, I'm not convinced that they have enough. Ironfoot halberdiers though, I mean this is a decent push this. The heavy goblins, I mean the armor piercing will be doing its best, but the level of these goblin units is not going to be up to the same standard as the attacking infantry that they perceive. And without any sort of support, slowly but surely, I do think the attackers will start to claim the initiative here, but the problem is the defenders have got so much that they can commit forward to stem the bleeding at this point, and indeed on this side of the front line they do have the blackbacks which will do that. They have a lot of trolls as well though, which if anything breaks through, the trolls are just going to be right on it. Goblin King's bodyguard are there, and then of course there's the catapult, which is going to try and shoot. I mean it is dangerous, the catapult. If they do get friendly fire because of heavy goblin morale being what it is, they could induce a chain rout in their own men. Misses and very nominal hits. Maybe they're going after the Ironfoot crossbows intentionally. They could rout them. It is possible. And like the Arthand on the front line now, and interestingly victory seems certain for them. I mean, in terms of unit type versus unit type, you'd expect the more aggressive infantry here to have the edge, but the Blackbacks have been in combat for a little while, and the Gwythiarth Arthand are really a step above even most bodyguard units when it comes to keeping themselves alive. The main concern here will be the Gwythiarth Arthand won't necessarily do damage all that quickly to the Blackbacks, and maybe that will prove to be an issue, but Khazad Reclaimers still trying to utilise those projectiles. Some hits coming in from the side. Not too surprisingly hit Ironfoot Warriors routing. And they will almost certainly be going after the crossbows here with this aggressive push of the trolls. I can only see this battle ending one way here as we start to march towards the final 10k frames, and it's in favour of the goblins, clearly. It depends on how much they have left in reserve and what quality level we're working with. They have Ironfoots, I mean Dragon Slayers. Individual units are not the problem here for the attackers, it's the fact that they do not have the numbers at this point, I don't think, and the fact that they have to be the ones to move into the defender's sphere of influence is a real problem. Goblin King's bodyguard also now moving onto the front line in a similar way to how the Blackbacks did, and that will certainly shore things up. They're less impressive from a damage dealing perspective, but a very dependable sword and board bodyguard unit. More snow trolls loitering, and yeah, this attack is going to be utterly crushed as well. The Obsidian Guard are on the way forward, but they're having to deal with a hailstorm of crossbow bolts, and clearly the fact that they still have ammunition, the defenders, is a sign that they have been using their ammunition wisely. Well, the catapult has fallen down the hill, but it still actually is usable. The crew fell down with it, so the classic medieval two-pronged of artillery sliding off cliffs is not necessarily going to be too much of an issue here. From Imladris Guardians and the Khazad Reclaimers coming in, so they are starting to try and effect some sort of advance. It may be too little too late, but it's better than doing nothing. At least you get to die with sword in hand, so to speak. Trying to go after the Gwythiarth Arthand, who are actually shaken. It's rare that you see the Gwythiarth Arthand shaken, but taking direct catapults hits and then saturated by crossbow bolts as well. Maybe it's not too surprising that the finest spears in the land are considering leaving. I think they're going to need to commit forward. I think it's probably time for a Hail Mary, honestly. From an attacking perspective, just throw everything in and see if the quality is enough to give the defenders pause, because as it is, it may end up being the slow death, the dreaded bleeding out at the wrists. Ironfoot Warriors arriving on the front line, but I mean, as far as basic infantry goes with an armour upgrade, they're fine, but ooh, that's a lot of friendly fire. A lot of trolls just died as a result of that. But they do rout the Ironfoot Warriors, so I mean, kind of worth it, I suppose, because it makes any kind of unified attack they were hoping to get together here to be their last hurrah more difficult. Over here, Gwythi Myrdain moving forward. That elven armour piercing. Some clear projectiles falling down from on high. The god Helene. Silverthorn arrows. In a static engagement like this, it's not as it's not as effective, but it will still help, and ultimately it is still good missile damage. Struggling a little bit here against the Gwyth. Is that correct? I assume that must be Imladris, given that they still have some units on that cliffside over there. Heavy Goblin crossbows ready to be committed to melee. Still some Black Uruks. Still more crossbow bolts coming in. I mean, to be fair, the level of quality that a lot of these units would offer in melee, Goblin King's Bodyguard aside, isn't actually that high, so even with the numbers discrepancy being what it is, the level of quality the defenders have to offer isn't terribly high as we enter the final 10k frames, but the attackers have been spinning their wheels here. I think they have been trying to get one big last assault going, but Erebor in particular is going up this really steep hill. It's proven to be an obstacle that the attackers really haven't been able to get to grips with. And that's really through no fault of their own. It's just the fact the defenders have had the right tools here on hand to deal with the situation. Victory is almost a certainty with the Imladris sentries moving in. So the elves actually making a bit of an impression over here at long last. It may come a little bit too late, but it does go to show that when the elven quality does get its teeth into units, the Misty Mountain's really going to struggle. I mean, you have really the two ends of the spectrum there in terms of you've got a quality focused faction in Imladris and then a quantity focused faction in the Misty Mountains. They're both really the zenith of what both things are in the game. And yeah, what have we? God Helene will still be strong in melee as well. The Blackbacks, I mean, the problem is the Blackbacks I don't think are going to have the opportunity to shoot into a position that will allow them to be extremely effective, but I think at this point you need to try and get them forward and at least try and get them firing into something. Forward come the Dragon Slayers. Erebor making their last roll of the dice at this point. I mean, the Dragon Slayers will easily lay low the Trolls as they start to fall. The Trolls, though, able to send the last assault packing, and it will allow the Misty Mountains to stack themselves up. Catapult, I mean, that was friendly fire. They are hitting the elves, but their own units are surely going to flee if they get hit by too much more of that. Yeah, the Black Uruk's shaken. Lesser Goblin units would probably have already run, so that is the upshot of having your Black Uruks on the front line doing the business. That is enough to rout the sentries though, so in the end it has proven to be worthwhile. It's been the story of this battle really. Every time the attackers have looked like maybe they could get something going, the defenders have slapped them down pretty hard with a combination of crossbows, high-end infantry, and on this occasion as well, a catapult. As the pikes make their way forward, ever the anchor on the front line that they are. Black Uruks in the mountains. Another unit of them moving forward as the Imladris Guardians try to make an impression. Elder Enway moving forward, so not entirely done yet, but like I said, I think it's just the slow death, and that was a very nice hit into the middle of those elven units. Moving forwards, hoping to do a lot of damage, but they themselves are getting savaged at the hands of those crossbows as well. Meanwhile, underneath the tree cover, Ironfoot crossbows trying to do their thing. The Dragon Slayers, even though numbers certainly in favour of the Goblins, it is an even fight over here, and indeed I would expect the Dragon Slayers to actually start pushing these units back, especially with the Blackbacks having already taken a little bit of damage. I would back the Dwarves to start making advances, but the problem is there's just going to be more units that the God Helene are routing as well, 28 of them. They might come back, but I don't know. Elder Enway as well, so that catapult even late on, even though it only started being utilised late on, when the battle had already gotten underway to a certain extent, in favour of the attackers, that is, in favour of the defenders, that is, I should say. It really has been a real factor in this battle, which has made the attackers' life almost an impossibility ever since their defeat in the north. Although, is there anything left over here? Oh, well. What have we here? Darthy Darth has got some units left. Mithril Guard have revealed themselves. Guards of Khazad as well. I mean, this is a fairly substantial little force, this. I still don't think it's going to be enough, and I question where this army was. Like, what were they doing? Have they run around from the other side? Is that it? And they've decided to try and pressurise the north once more. I mean, it's not the worst idea, I suppose, given the fact that hitting multiple angles and stretching the battlefield is what you want to be doing as the attackers generally, but this might come a little bit too late, but you never can tell. I mean, let's have a look. Yeah, I think the Misty Mountains are too far ahead at this stage for this to make a huge difference, but I mean, considering the quality level of a lot of their units left, it will close the gap fairly considerably, this, I would imagine, as the dwarves will almost certainly butcher their way through several of the kinds of units that are on the front line. The Black Uruks will give a good accounting of themselves, but any heavy goblins that are perceived will not be able to do the same thing. Dragon Slayers doing their best. I mean, throwing their low quality units onto the front line. I mean, a veritable sea of goblin faces stands before the dwarves as they continue their ill-fated advance uphill. But it's a good opportunity for the Dragon Slayers to fill their boots in terms of kills if they do want to commit heavy goblin crossbows as a melee force. What's going on here? What is... That's not the way. I don't know what they're doing there. They're inviting disaster upon themselves. There's only the Blacklock Engineers that are still attempting to make something happen over here. I mean, they are a multiple HP unit. Their melee stats are obviously not up to the same level as the other multiple HP Dwarven units, but it's only a battered and bruised unit of Black Uruks that are in the way. Yeah, still doing decently over there. I'm still not entirely sure why all of those units were pulled off the front line, even though they're only heavy goblin crossbows. They would... That was the Dwarven General. That must be why they were pulled off the front line. Utilising the artillery instead, and hitting heavy goblin crossbows when they're trying to do the business against Dragon Slayers is only going to end in disaster. They hit their own units as well that were still in there. Ironfoot Warriors rout. The God Halim did come back, I think, but... Yes... The north, what have we here? I mean, this is actually a more comprehensive engagement now than the tattered remnants of the attackers in the south, and there's still projectiles flying. So the rationing of their crossbow bolts has been done pretty much perfectly, I would suggest, and that is surely playing a large role in why the defenders have done so well in this battle. They've always had some crossbow volleys on hand when they needed them. Doing the business here against the dwarves. Although, you know, heavy goblin crossbows are not going to be the sort of thing that you want to be sending into combat against Mithril Guard and expecting them to achieve much of anything. The Blackbacks carving their way through a more isolated unit of 3rd Legion. The dwarves behind can't really turn around and come to their aid either, because they need to deal with the goblins that are pouring down from uphill. Victory seems certain against the heavy goblin crossbows, that's not too surprising. Guards of Khazad are a little bit all over the place now. Mithril Guard moving in. Black Uruks, as I said, will give a better accounting of themselves than the heavy goblin crossbows at the very least, but they're still outmatched 1-to-1 by far by the Mithril Guard. Defending general falls. I mean, the Misty Mountains are somewhat fragile in that respect, so you may see Winged Swordsman's army largely flee for the hills. rotting meat being utilised. Again, that's more likely to have a negative impact on the Misty Mountains than it is on the attackers. There goes another Dwarven general. We are very much in the home straight now. Generals falling left and right. Engagements starting to wrap up for good across the battlefield. Ironfoot crossbows outclassed by Black Uruks in melee, it would be fair to say. Dependent on their decent defensive stats in melee, which are not insignificant, but yeah. Will it indeed? Will victory be yours? Yes, I think it will. Yeah, there go the Black Locks. So that's going to be the end of that, and surely all of those units will be committed as well down here to finally finish things off over here. The God Helene that returned, only 9 of them remain, however. There's 16 Dragon Slayers, again 16 armor-piercing dwarves, not the ideal thing to see still alive. But now as we see the Black Uruks being largely lent upon for their slightly higher quality to put the battle beyond the attackers at this stage. 3rd Legion are routing. Wasn't the worst idea from Darthy Dart. I mean, it's not as if they had much of a choice. They were dying on the southern approach, so may as well take the long route around. It didn't arrive quickly enough by any means, but by that point there was no other choice. Only the Meteor Guard really remain. There's some Blackbacks on the way over here as well, which will give some much needed support to the Black Uruks of the mountains, and that will probably be enough to finally finish the dwarves off. Still. A bloody fight on this hillside, and not really once upon this engagement over here did I ever really feel as though the attackers had the edge in the initial engagements anyway. I mean, when Darthy Dar's army arrived, maybe the defenders weren't expecting it initially, so there was some slight pushback, but then reinforcements were very quick to arrive on the scene, and there simply weren't enough dwarves left to deal with the goblin horde that fell upon them. At least in the south there were a few examples of some pushback, but largely I think the defenders have played more than well enough to thoroughly deserve the victory here. We'll talk about what the attackers could have done in the endgame splash screen, I think, because I think there were different ways in which they could handle things, but this map in general is going to be a difficult one for the attackers, and especially when you're dealing with... This is a situation in which I think the Misty Mountains approach of numbers heavy is really going to help you as the defenders. Especially with some of the strengths they have in terms of their crossbows, which I think were the MVPs here. I think heavy goblin crossbows have to be considered the most important unit on the field here. They brought so many of them and utilised their ammunition so well, but it was always going to be difficult for a more quality-focused attacking army because of the stopping power and, you know, just outright speed of killing that crossbows can do to even some really strong units that, especially the dwarves, would have been depending upon to do the business in this battle today. But it is what it is. General here, getting some backup from some Blackback Berserkers. The Dragon Slayers will be the last ones left standing on this hillside here. Plenty of Black Uruks still there. An interesting kind of battle though. Seeing this map, I think this has been the most popular map to send in this year just generally. This will be the last example that we see of it this year as well. And this one perhaps is the most different that we've seen. And once again we're going to see a defending victory, just like we did on Minas Tirith, and a fairly comprehensive defending victory once again. So 2 in a row, where I guess it goes to show that if the attackers don't have a unified approach, and if all the attackers don't know what they're doing when they're doing it, it can result in things sliding out of control for them, and that's happened both on Minas Tirith and here, I would suggest. And then, if the defenders can play efficiently, use their ammunition well, commit their units as and when they need them properly, that can make all the difference in the world, and it makes the defenders a more terrifying force Two very different factions as well that we've seen be effective on the defence as well, with Gondor first and now the Misty Mountains. And I guess at this point, given that this is the last engagement, we will go up to ×2 speed to see the final dwarves put on their last stand. And there we have it. Well-earned victory this. In fact, I think we'll probably go up to ×6 speed. Dragon Slayers won't go down easily. Even the Black Uruks with their decent attack stats. High-level dwarven units do have a tendency to do this sort of thing in the late game when they're on the losing side anyway. And there we have it. Victory for the goblins, and they maintain their home. So there you go. And like I said, defenders, worthy victors, good use of their ranged ammunition, crossbows, the catapult, which only really got involved later on when the defenders were already in the ascendancy, but it really made sure that the attackers had to stay down, so to speak. And I think for the attacking point of view, from an attacking point of view, the thing that they should have done differently, I think, on this map, given how the defenders were set up, the only real way to not have this happen in the extent it did, or even a lesser extent, was very high levels of aggression on all three of the choke points. Because then, yes, Erebor probably would have been smashed to bits by the catapult. The crossbows would have been, you know, reaping a bloody harvest across the whole field, but it would have forced the defenders' hands. And I think that's the only way that it would have been, at the very least, more aggression, maybe not like outright aggression, but as it was, because of the northern attack getting underway and the southern attack not really following suit, by the time the southern attack was getting underway, the north was already falling apart, and they had to send over Darthy Darth's Khazad remnant to pick up the slack, but dwarves are going to take a long time to cross the field, especially when they have to go around a whole mountain. All in all, it started to slide out of control for the attackers fairly early on, you'd have to say, and they never really regained their footing after that. So I think going all in, or at least, you know, a large amount of their army in, right from the off across all of the choke points, would have at least done damage. But this is a difficult map for the attackers. This is one of those maps where the defenders do have a pretty reasonable chance of holding on to themselves if they manage to support their front lines properly, which the Misty Mountains most certainly did on this occasion. So let's see what did the damage for them. Hertumihai, Blackback Mountain Berserkers, which were a key part of their front lines. Like, this was the damage dealing high quality unit that was able to go toe to toe with especially the dwarven units, but they also did pretty well against the elves also. The trolls, maybe not a huge amount in terms of kills, but when they were committed, it did cause front lines to fold. So I'd still say that the trolls did their job well enough. The crossbows, definitely the most key element of the Misty Mountains defence today. It made the attackers' lives a misery, you'd have to say. Heavy Goblin Spears doing alright, and then the catapult getting a good amount of kills late on to truly see the defenders over the line. I imagine it's going to be somewhat similar over here. Blackback Berserkers slightly less, but still decent. White Uruk Fearmongers as well, acting as a good anchor. Spears, Snow Trolls for this army doing very well as well, and then the Heavy Goblin Crossbows largely getting over 100 kills each. Very nice return on the Drake Broodlings for 107, given the fact that I said that kills are not necessarily their primary focus. But yeah, they were used effectively as well, which is another factor. I mean, crossbows used effectively, Drake Broodlings used effectively, and of course the Bolx Champions with 317 kills. When the northern attack started to fall apart, very decisive action with their lance-wielding Warg Riders. And finally, Winged Swordsman himself, several units getting over 100 kills here as well. Blackback Berserkers once again, Heavy Goblin Crossbows, General was in that unit as well, interestingly enough. Black Uruks doing quite nicely. We saw them, particularly late on, basically be the unit that was high quality enough to prevent the small but still very high quality attacking armies from gaining much of a foothold, so the Black Uruks doing their job there most certainly, and then the crossbows, of course, once again proving to be the match winners. So there we have it. Big thank you to Winged Swordsman 44 for sending this one in. Big thank you to all of the players as well for being a part of this battle replay. Not really much to report at this point. Still got a couple of historical scenarios sent to me by Lord of Belagos, which we'll be doing probably in the next... There'll probably be the next two that come out actually after this one. Got one more from Winged Swordsman 44, although considering that this one is probably going to be the first battle that comes out in the month of November, by that point I may very well have gotten more from him given the density with which he sends me replays. I've got one battle in Silmarillion that was sent to me by Captain Gervais. Yeah, plenty to be getting on with. I think November, as far as a schedule in terms of content, is going to be taking shape, especially given that the live stream, I think, will be happening at some point halfway towards the end of November sometime, because I think that will be when the situation becomes far clearer. But it is what it is. I won't ramble too much about that on this occasion anyway. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.